Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Outcast for December 2023. I am your host, Adam Koralik, and today I am joined by Abdullah. Welcome back, Abdullah.
Hey, happy to be back.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Unfortunately, no Rob this month. He's off doing criminal things and illicit activities. Actually, I have no idea what he's doing, but he's unavailable. So it's just going to be Abdullah and I for this first section. If you are brand new to this podcast, it is a Patreon-funded and supported podcast. So people who are on Patreon get early access to it. You also get early access to my videos. You can also get things like shout-outs. You can pick subjects. You can even be on the podcast, which is exactly what Abdullah did. So thank you, as always, for being a returning champion, Abdullah.
No worries about that. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And with one of those perks, you get to pick subjects. However, Abdullah, you didn't really seem to have one, so I decided to come up with kind of like one general topic that I thought we could just kind of have as a discussion here in replacement of that. So there was a couple of things that were announced relatively recently at the time we're recording this, and I kind of did little videos talking about each one, but I thought, you know, it'd be nice to get your take on it and also just kind of discuss it in a more general way. E3, as you probably heard, is no longer going to be a thing. Yeah, we also had the Game Awards occur, which was a very boring thing to watch. I don't know if you attempted to, except for one thing, which is the other thing I want to talk about, which was the Sega announcements. I assume you heard about that.
Yeah, that I did.
So, I just kind of want to talk about all of this at once. You know, like the fact that, you know, what does it say that E3 is over and that kind of, you know, the Game Awards is now like the only one of these like third-party shows that kind of exists, and it was just like painful to get through, and the fact that they kind of happen back to back. And I don't know, I'm more curious because, so here's the thing, I went to E3 multiple times because I actually work in that industry. So like, for you as just a third party, like, what's your take on the whole E3 thing?
Okay, so here's so I'm just gonna say that obviously from given, you know, that I live overseas, where E3 is held, so I've never gotten the chance to attend it. Even though I always had it in my mind as a kid that, hey, when I get older, I'll attend it, but apparently that's not gonna happen. And from my side, it was always interesting to you know, hear all about the announcements, and because of the time difference, we'd usually my brother and I would set up an alarm to wake up at times where we know, for example, Sega would be announcing something, or Nintendo or something like that, and then we would get up and watch it. So that's what I was experiencing when it came to E3. And what hurts me the most is that I won't be able to attend it. Now I know it has deteriorated, obviously, with time, but in the end, you know, that thing as a kid that you have always wanted to do, and you know, you can't experience it, that's a bummer. So that's what I would say in terms of E3. Now, the Game Awards, I've not seen those. I'm not interested to. Just interested in.
You really didn't miss anything.
Not just interested to know the announcements or whatever has been said or whatever has happened. The Sega announcements that you mentioned, maybe you can talk about that after E3. But yeah, in general, E3 for me was. So I'm a Sonic fan. So most of what I cared about in E3 was whatever Sonic stuff was going to be announced, maybe Nintendo. But with time, you know, this Nintendo Directs came and all. It started to lose its charm, but I could still see, you know, the nostalgia factor related to it. But if you take facts and reality into perspective, yeah, it makes sense why this happened, right? And even though the recent one was cancelled, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft didn't even want to take part of it anyway. So you could see it happening, but it's also a pain. But it's also something that's, I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, the thing with E3 is, you know, it started off as a trade show for the industry, just to like have a place for everybody to get together to figure out what products were coming, who was going to buy what was going to be available, to be able to make certain announcements and, you know, get that to publications like magazines and stuff. It wasn't meant to be this big thing we all like watch on YouTube, but that's what eventually it had to evolve into to even try to survive. But honestly, the original sin of the whole thing, the thing that really took it down, you can argue that it was the digital age and the fact that, you know, it was now accessible to the public to at least see visually. That made it exciting for a phase. But, you know, with that also came the things like Twitter being able to destroy it, because, you know, there was an easy way to spoil a show with a simple tweet. Like anyone with a keyboard could, if they had access to whatever information was going to be in the show, they could ruin an entire PR team's like months of work in you know, 10 seconds.
You can't avoid that.
And, yeah, exactly. And that was becoming a problem. But while that was definitely a factor, the other one was just kind of, because that was increasing, a bunch of these third-party developers, and even the first-party ones, you know, Nintendo famously being the beginning of this, just decided they wanted to pull out of it. You know, Nintendo, I think, pulled out of E3 2012. I think that's how far back it goes. And they started doing Nintendo Directs, and that way they had more in-house control over what they were saying. And, you know, they weren't that stupid. They were willing to time it with E3 and just release their stuff around there. But they didn't want to do a big song and dance performance. I think they still had a booth presence, but they didn't do the big show. And over time, you know, a bunch of companies just being like, I don't want to do a booth presence. Those things are really expensive. We don't really get much out of it. And then I know, as you mentioned too earlier, Sony and then eventually Microsoft pulled out as well. So then you were down to just third-party developers, and a lot of third-party developers were like, well, what's the point? Because when nobody else is there, why are we? You know, etc. And that there's a lot of money.
Yeah, the big guys are.
Yeah, like, I went to 3 different E3s. Let me tell you, these companies put in a metric ton of money to get this stuff produced. Like millions and millions of dollars for stage presence, you know, not only in the construction of it, but, you know, the distribution of it, the advertisement of it, of course, paying their employees to manage it all, flying people in and out, putting up accommodations. Like, there's tons of money that went into that. And when they don't think there's a profit motive behind it, or at least it's not even good for advertising, there isn't really a reason to do it. So it's interesting because I don't think a whole lot of companies actually wanted to do it. It was just something they were kind of expected to do, and you didn't want to be that company that just ditched E3 because they were too big. But to Nintendo's credit or blame, you know, you can call it to their detriment perhaps, they were willing to be the first bad guy that just said they didn't want to do it. And it only got worse after that. So I got to do the show 3 times. I went in 2017, 2018, and 2019 as media, which was nice. I did a whole video talking about that specifically, but like, you know, dude, you remember that year, and I think it was 2019, the Keanu Reeves year where he just showed up at the Xbox conference? Like, I was in the room for that. I got to see that happen. And, you know, it's like I had no idea that was going to be some big special moment. So E3 gave me a lot of cool memories. But for anybody out there who never attended, like you didn't, I will tell you right now, if you were in the general public trying to see E3, it would not have been the same experience. The only reason I had a good time at E3 is because I, you know, was industry, so I was able to get into the lounges, the private access to the demos, you know, into the private parties, like the Machinima party I got to go into. What's the name of that? Logitech randomly had a party. Like, everybody had parties, but you could only get into them if you were on certain lists. So I was able to get in theirs, Ubisoft's, Sega's, you know, 2K's, etc., Microsoft's as well, Bethesda. So you can get into these companies, and that's when it's interesting, because then there's something to see, there's something to celebrate. But if you were just like, I think in 2017, the first year I went, was also the first time they opened to the public, and when they did that, you could effectively buy a badge, and that would allow you into the show, but it didn't do anything else. So you couldn't like cut lines, you couldn't get into lounges, you couldn't talk to developers, you couldn't do anything special. You basically were just going to a show, waiting in a really long line to play a demo of a game that's going to be out in like a few months, and that was about all you'd get out of it. You'd be lucky to do 4 games in a day. So I guess what I'll say is they probably opened it to the public just to try and generate more revenue and more interest, but I can't imagine anyone who did that as the public was that happy with the situation. And I think it was just kind of an attempt to keep the show afloat. So let me just say this. You probably would not have actually enjoyed E3 unless you actually worked in the industry. Does that
it does make sense a lot. Because I put in an analogy to, for example, something like the Comic Con we have here. I never had, although it's not exactly the same, but it wasn't great until I had the chance to be an exhibitor there, and that's when it got interesting, and I got to have fun with it. But when I was doing it like part of the general public, there's a big difference there. It's not exactly E3 is not a Comic Con, but I could see your point here.
Yeah, exactly. That behind the scenes access is kind of everything. Because, when I would go there, like I said, I already told some of these stories, but like, for example, Ubisoft actually paid my way out there. They paid for my hotels, they paid for my flights, they gave me badges, all that sort of stuff. And so because they do all that, it's not costing me anything, but at the same time, it also gave me the ability to like just waltz into their lounge and get free food whenever I want, play their games whenever I want, talk to developers whenever I want. And you can play all their stuff in the span of an hour. You don't have to wait in these ridiculous long lines, and you don't do it while standing at some sweaty, demo is like in this hot room. It's a privately chilled area with comfortable couches. And that was just one company, because once you're in there, like a bunch of them will open that door for you. So, again, I was doing that with Sega and 2K and Bethesda, everybody. And I'm going to be honest, guys, that's the only reason it was ever cool. And it was great while it lasted. I got to do it 3 times. I consider that 3 more times than I should have been allowed to do it, but it was great. I had a good time. But those days were over. And even these last couple of years where E3 was like technically around, they really couldn't figure out what their situation was with the digital distribution version and a very small presence. And I can absolutely see why this just had to stop. It just didn't make sense anymore. And one thing I noticed, and this is more of a internal matter, with every time I would go to E3, kind of the old dogs that had been doing this forever, they were just tired of it. They just tired of flying to Los Angeles and having to do this show. And all of them would be like, dude, I'd much rather stay at home and have like Bethesda or whoever send me a DLC key or something to just check out the latest update, rather than make me fly all the way across the country to go check something out for a few minutes. Like, I don't know. I'm not like that because I love to travel, but most gamers don't. Most gamers are very insular people that are just like, if I could just update a couple of files on my Xbox and have it download something, I'd much rather do that than fly across the country to check it out. And I kind of get that. But at the same time, I don't know, man. It was just kind of a special experience, but I say that with the asterisk, understanding that you had to be kind of in the club in order for it to be special.
Yeah, that's true. I could exactly see why that's the case, because even if you think about the general public, as you said, it would be too much, especially if somebody was going to fly there. Like, nobody's going to pay for your ticket, nobody's going to help you out. You have to do it all alone, and also go through these lines just to play something for a little bit and have people yell at you to, okay, my turn, whatever. It is. I think it all boils down, like what we just said in general, that it's just a matter of how technology is right now, the evolution that has happened. It's just because E3 was good, the nature of how things used to happen before was in line with whatever E3 was doing, because you can't get your news unless you have specific. You used to get your news from specific places, and that was good when earlier on. But right now, as you said, Twitter or whatever, you could just get it in a second, and somebody out there is just gonna spread it. So it's not really feasible.
Exactly. I think the other issue, and I'm just saying this as an American because I can make fun of it, the other problem was also that it was in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a great city when you're not in downtown Los Angeles, but that's where the con is. Downtown Los Angeles is like a bomb went off in it. Like, it's just, it feels almost like you're in Fallout. Like, I remember one of the years, I think it was the year that Fallout 76 was announced. The joke was that they had designed LA to kind of look like Fallout 76, but obviously that wasn't really true. Because downtown LA, especially near where the convention center is, there's no permanent population, so there's nothing open past like 6 p.m. and it's just weird. And so if you were staying there, you know, as you're out of town and they put you in a hotel, the hotels will be nice. But you're like, oh, let's go out in the town and get some food. It's like, you better be taking a car somewhere much further away into like Hollywood or another. Like LA as a city overall is great, but the downtown component of it is just kind of nothing. And I think that was another factor why people were always complaining about having to go to E3, because they're like, once I get there, like, I'm kind of stuck in the hotel. There's not much else to do there.
Yeah, if you can't get food from outside, then you have to pay hotel prices.
Precisely. So I mean, to be fair, what most people would do is they would just, you know, get at least an Uber by that point and then just go out somewhere else. Like, again, LA is a great city when you're not in the downtown part of it, but the actual downtown component is bad. You know, whatever. It got a little better in the later years. Like, at least the Subway, you know, would open. When I say Subway, I mean Subway sandwiches would stay open a little later, which is pathetic that that's like a high bar, but whatever. I guess all I'm trying to say here, guys, is if you had this dream of attending E3, yes, unfortunately, that won't be a thing now. But unless you were going to be in media or in the industry and the inside, you probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much as you think you would have. Because I think a lot of people had this dream that they're just going to get early access to all these big games and it's going to be this special event. That is true with a big condition that you were in there. The public wasn't going to get a whole lot of that. So on that subject as well, like we said, with the Game Awards also happened, and there was that big Sega announcement. So I was trying to blend these together by saying the Game Awards is now ipso facto, like default, kind of E3's, I'm not going to say replacement because that certainly isn't accurate, but at least it was like a show that was kind of neutral as far as who produced it, meaning it wasn't made by Microsoft, Sony, or Nintendo, and it showed new game trailers and that kind of thing. Which was cool to see, but I mean, I watched the Game Awards. I know you didn't, and I can only watch it up to a point because it was dull, man. And I get that not everybody wants to watch it, just like not everybody's gonna sit down and want to watch the Oscars or like the NBA draft. Sometimes you just want to see the information at the end, and you don't want to sit through all these song and dance. And so I watched it as long as I could, but at least it had some new games announced. And I'm wondering now that they got a lot of criticism for how the Game Awards was. And now that E3 is officially over, I have to wonder if they're going to try and spice that up in the future and if the Game Awards will become its own big show. But I don't know. That's just me pulling it, just waxing a name there. But I will say that Sega stole the show. I assume you heard about that.
So I did hear about them. I don't think I'm. This is a unique interest in general. Obviously, the Jet Set Radio and the Crazy Taxi thing were the thing I'm most excited about, and the fact that they said there's more coming. So to me, since I grew up mainly in the GameCube, Dreamcast, Xbox era, PlayStation 2, that kind of made it's interesting to me. And I know that there hasn't been any Jet Set Radio game ever since the one on the Xbox. I think Future.
Yep.
So that's probably what was interesting to me. I'm looking forward to hearing what's coming more and more details regarding it. But there's also something from my side that's thinking that, hey, since these are like Dreamcast related things, maybe there will be a Sonic thing coming up. That's what I'm hoping would happen. I'm not sure if they did
you never
announce
have to
it or
worry
not.
about more Sonic. Yeah.
No, Sonic,
never
like
have to worry about more Sonic.
That's true, but I mean an adventure kind of related thing, like an
Sonic Adventure 3, right?
Not 3, but at least maybe if they do a remake or something of the Adventure series altogether, and from that stems an adventure for kind of like what happened with Crash. Like,
sure.
I'm hoping that happens or something similar happens, but getting Crazy Taxi and Jet Set Radio again is probably the thing I'm most excited about, especially like Crazy Taxi. You would get to see it in all new graphics and things like that.
So yeah, obviously I did a video on this as well because I obviously kind of lost my mind. I was like, wow, this is great, because usually when Sega teases something like this, it ends up being stupid. The examples I cited before is I remember years ago they showed some like teaser for like some a Tokyo Game Show. It was like this this like feather falling and these blades of grass, and everybody's like, and they're like, our new big game is coming, and it was like, whoa, everybody stay tuned. So people are staying up till the middle of the night and here for Tokyo Game Show, and it was like some soccer game exclusive to Japan, and just pissed everyone off. And then like at the same time, a few years later, they did the same thing. Like, we have a special surprise announcement at Gamescom or whatever it was. And it turned out they were like selling more t-shirts, and it was like, I know I love Sega, but they have a tendency to really let you down with those kind of announcements. So I was kind of expecting more of the same with this new age, new era energy thing they were doing. And I was shocked, like absolutely shocked, when they were like, all right, here we go. We got a new Jet Grind Radio, a new Golden Axe, a new Streets of Rage, a new Shinobi, and a new Crazy Taxi. What? Mic drop. I mean, they stole the show with that announcement. That was like, of all the coverage I have seen of the Game Awards, everyone says that Sega stole the show.
That's probably the highlight. What was the highlight? I mean, I didn't watch anything, but I just wanted to know what happened, and probably that's the biggest thing that happened. That's the only thing I know that happened there. Yeah,
that was a fantastic moment. I was like, wow. So because I made a video about it, I had a lot of feedback on that where people were giving their input, and of course the big winner was Jet Grind Radio. That seems to be what everyone was the most excited about. And then usually Crazy Taxi came in second. And there was an interesting point that people said that Streets of Rage probably would have been higher, except that we got Streets of Rage 4, so that was a little bit satiated by that appetite was quenched per se. So there was, I will say, the one that people seemed the least interested in though was Golden Axe. It seems like a lot of people kind of didn't care about that one. So we'll see what happens with that. But as for what you said specifically about the possibility of more Sonic Adventure, it's interesting, because I definitely thought what you were going with that was Sonic Adventure 3, because everybody's been talking about that forever. I wasn't considering a remake of 1 and 2. That would be cool. Obviously we've had re-releases, HD re-releases of those two games. I think the problem you run into though with both of those, more so with the Sonic Adventure 3, not so much with the remake of 1 and 2, is that those were the last like Sonic games that Yuji Naka worked on, and there is absolutely no way they're getting that guy back, considering he's, I think, in prison, or is going to be.
Whatever that is exactly.
Yeah, I don't know all the details of how that played out ultimately, but yeah, there was let's just say a lot of legal drama around him.
Yeah, but
and go ahead.
Yeah, that's true, right? But when it comes to 1 and 2, if they do some sort of thing, a remake or whatever, it would at least be something that could let us go to an adventure style game. I'm not saying Adventure 3. I'm saying an adventure kind of game.
I'm actually with you. I think the idea of a Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 like remake, not remaster, not re-release,
remake from the ground up.
Yeah, from the ground up. I think that's actually a very good idea, because you have enough talented devs that they can basically clone the games that already exist. Just you cited the perfect example, like Crash Bandicoot, the remake, but don't up it to Dark Souls level difficulty, I suppose. But other than that, because that was the big complaint with that re-release. Make it like just as fun, but using basically a modern graphics engine essentially. I think that could do very well. That would also Sega loves to put out Sonic stuff. I don't think they would have too much of a hard time justifying that one, and at the same time it would definitely appeal to a lot of us Dreamcast era fans. That's good fan service, and at the same time you also test the viability of Sonic Adventure 3. So I agree with you on that. And Sega was very clear that there's more content like this coming. Now, which IPs they're going to select from is anybody's guess. Obviously, the fan in me says Shenmue, but I know full well that if Shenmue 4 was going to be a thing, it would come from YSNet. It would not come from Sega directly. So then the question is, like, what other dormant Sega IPs do people want? And people were listing a whole bunch of them. My first choice was actually Rystar, which almost nobody remembers. But a lot of people was throwing out the obvious ones like Nights into Dreams and seeing that.
That could be good, but
Panzer Dragoon stuff, especially Saga. People really want that back. There was not a single person. The one franchise that I thought at least one person would suggest that I don't recall getting a single comment about was Echo the Dolphin.
Yeah, I'm actually, funny enough, I'm staring at that game right now. It's over there on the shelf.
Yeah, it's funny too because I actually know the guy like personally who made that game, and I still am not like a huge fan of it. But like, I mean, I just even as a kid when I tried playing that, I was like, I just don't. Why is this supposed to be fun? I just
Yeah,
whatever.
but you could get it like from 90s. These things happened a lot.
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, regardless, so it's cool to see Sega making moves. A lot of people are like, oh, they're making a new console. No, they're not. That's not what this is. And then some people have been saying that this might be part of some overall streaming package. It's going to be digital only. It's or whatever. I'm like, you don't know any of that yet.
Yeah, and if
Knowing
it's digital
Sega,
only, then we're dead. But okay.
well, here's the thing with that. So if you pay attention to a lot of Sega's releases over the last couple of years, other than the really big ones that come out initially, like your Yakuza's, and I guess now anything by Atlas, and Sonic, even to an extent, but not in all cases, they almost always start off digitally for like the first year, and then they just kind of get physical releases later, usually through limited run games. Like that's actually where Streets of Rage got its limited release. Sonic Mania, of course, was Sonic, but it got a physical release like a year later.
Sonic Mania
I think it was
Plus or
Sonic
something.
Origins. Yeah. Sonic Origins too did not get a physical edition right away. So I will not be in any way shocked if we find out a lot of these games, at least initially, are getting digital editions only. And then over time, I would in no way be surprised if all of them get physical editions through something like limited run games. That would be my guess because that's usually what Sega does. At least modern day Sega typically does that.
That's probably the trend they're gonna go for.
So next up, we have a round of shout-outs. All the following people are Patreon backers, and they are cool enough to support the show, support the channel, keep me going, all that sort of fun stuff. I appreciate all of you. And these in particular are at the level in which they get a shout-out. So shout-out to Cax, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Once again, that is Cax, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Thank you so much for the support. Now, next up, we have another subject here. This subject was chosen by a Patreon backer by the name of Spencer Per Year. And so every month he gets to pick a subject. This is what he wanted us to talk about. And you can kind of mutate this into whatever you want. But he basically just said the highs and lows of collecting in 2023, which I kind of took to mean my personal high and my personal low. But you could also talk about it as a general trend, whatever you want to say. Do you have any stories?
Okay, so actually, I did have a really good good deal. Locally, my friend owns a game shop. Managed to get a 3DS that I even didn't know it existed. I didn't know that it was a thing anyway. It's called the 3DS Ambassador Edition. He got it from the UK or something. Yeah, from the UK. So I managed to get that. That's a highlight. I managed to get a deal on it with him. We talked through and through. It took some time, but I managed to get that. That's probably my highest thing, the best thing I got in 2023, besides the Wii U stuff. So it was more focused on quality, and I'm pretty sure that that's probably the best deal. By the way, I still don't have it here physically. It's still not here physically with me, but it's secured.
So I think, and this might be some recency bias, but I think my personal high of the year, as far as like the coolest thing I picked up that was, where I got a good deal on it and I was happy about that, and it was just something I never expected to get, was the Brazilian exclusive Super Master Compact 3 or whatever it was. What's it called? It's a portable version of the Sega Master System that Sega made only for the Brazilian market.
It was really big there.
Not. Yeah, exactly. The Master System is still active in Brazil, which is insane. But these days, they're basically just little emulators on a chip. But in the early 90s, when they actually made this piece of hardware, it was still like a legitimate piece of hardware. And it was exclusive to just one country. And not the usual player type of countries, like a European country or, the States, Canada, Japan, etc. Brazil. They made like an exclusive console to Brazil, and I never expected to actually really own it because I was just like, that's getting Brazilian stuff's like impossible. And so this year at Portland Retro Game Expo, this guy goes by the handle NT Games. He's a Brazilian dude. He comes to this. I think he actually lives in the States, but he's from Brazil originally, and he goes back there all the time. And he just picks up stuff and brings it back. So he brought us bunch of stuff to the con, and that system can be like $1,200 boxed USD, and he sold it to me for like $200, like unbelievable deal. So I was really happy with that, and I actually had some stuff to trade, so I had traded that, and I basically got $200 cash. So I just traded a bunch of stuff I didn't need and got this thing I'd always wanted. So to me, that was like the personal best pickup of the year. And now fundamentally, it's useless. It's a wireless portable version of the Master System that has no screen, which means that it's supposed to play the games through RF broadcast to a television, which is terrible. But it's more about not so much the practical use of it as it is just the novelty of it. I've actually sent it out to get it recapped and everything so that it's, preventative maintenance, but I'm going to be able to do a rare variants video on it soon. And yeah, it's just going to be cool to have that.
Yeah, but this just reminds me of something quick. I think the Dreamcast also had a special release. It's not a special, but there's a Brazilian Dreamcast variant, right?
Yeah, the tech toy version.
Yeah, I remember that being on my bucket list, but I can never find that.
My lows, if I'm honest, this year I picked up very few new releases. Like I still don't have, Starfield, or I don't have Spider-Man 2. I don't have Super Mario Wonderland, any of that. I'd love to. It's like part of me is like, like I'll get around to it. And so that bothers me. But if you want to know the truth, Abdullah, the big low of the year is that I am still waiting on you to send me that Arab drift cars thing.
Do you know I still have that?
Do you even remember what I'm talking about? Yeah,
I do.
I'm just messing around.
I still have that.
For those who don't know,
yeah.
What was the name of that game? Was it Arab Drift Cars?
Arab Drift Cars, something like that. I have that. I still do.
Yeah.
But
if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, if you don't know what I'm talking about, look up Arab Drift Cars for PS4. It looks fake. It does not look like a game. It looks completely made up, but it actually exists. And which countries did it come out in?
It came over here, and I think in Saudi Arabia, in
GCC
region in general, yeah, Gulf region.
Yeah, the Gulf region. So it came out in a few select Gulf region countries. It's going to be like some stupid rare game at some point, I'm sure. So Abdullah is the only person I know over there. I was like, yo!
Actually,
and you actually got it.
I actually have it, and it's still here. Probably life got it, and there was a while when I couldn't do the podcast for a while. And I completely forgot.
I'm just messing
now that
around.
you reminded me, I'm gonna have that sent.
Yeah, I appreciate it. No, I was just messing around about that. If you ever ship it, that's cool. If not, I'll live. But like,
I actually have it still here, and I have like, I told you how much I got it for here. I got it basically at the regular price.
Yeah, exactly, because you can get it retail there. So it also just looks like a meme. It does not look like it could actually be real.
It's a full thing, and I got it, and it's sealed and everything.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of answers that, unless you have any other stories you can think of.
No, I'm good, pretty much.
All right. Well then, thank you to Spencer Purrier for that subject, and Abdullah, thank you for joining us as always. And we're back. Hey, Joseph has joined us. Welcome back, Joseph.
Glad to be back, Adam. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on. So, as always, you get to pick a subject. You didn't really seem to have one, so we kind of chatted this out a little bit, and this is what we came up with. So, as you know, there's been a lot of hullabaloo about a lot of digital media rights mostly because of stuff Sony did, but I mean, they're not alone in this. There's a history of this happening with other companies. And I thought, I've done a bunch of videos on this lately, but you're actually someone that actively downloads games, legitimate means, whatever platforms. So I kind of wanted to get your take on, does digital content not being considered property bother you?
I mean, not really, to be quite honest. I mean, in the sense that you saying that it's not property doesn't bother me, because even though they say buy, you are technically right. I mean, it's not. Yeah, I buy the games. I, in theory, have them as long as Steam is still around, but as we've said, that's as long as Steam is still around, and you've brought it up like quite a few times in those videos that you say that content can disappear at any time, which no one really thinks about because they didn't, like, say with the whole thing with Sony and like the thing that like last year that happened with Amazon with a bunch of Warner Brothers stuff, or
Yep.
going away despite people bought it and they can't actually use it again, despite the fact that they bought it and should have been in their library forever. Like, people didn't think about that because it wouldn't necessarily be thinkable that the company would just be like, yeah, no, you just can't have this anymore, for most people. Now, you've brought up that it was always a possibility, but honestly, until like recently, I figured that, yeah, it's a possibility, but other than in circumstances where, like, say you get banned or something, and you lose your account, which is still bad and really shouldn't be the case, that you could lose access to all your stuff. But other than that, or like the actual store like closing, never occurred to me that even if something was delisted that you wouldn't be able to re-download it, because historically that actually hasn't been how it's gone. Like, most of the time when a game gets delisted off like Xbox Live or Steam or the PlayStation Store, you can still download it again if you bought it. They just can't sell new copies, is what usually happens, and what most people would think of as happening when a game's no longer available on a store. But clearly that's not the case. So at this point now, I guess the fact that it is a thing that actually can be removed like that does bother me a little. But on the same token, though, like, I have a Steam Deck. I've been primarily playing games on PC. I was out of options before I even joined this ecosystem and really, like, started actually building a PC. So, and my thought process, like, with Steam was never, like, actually believing that whole thing where they were like, yeah, if we're going to go out of business, we'll just turn off all our DRM and everything will be fine. No. If they're going out of business, they have more problems to think about. But with PC, I've just figured that in that case it would just be like, well, you know what? Most of the games that I'm going to want to get on PC that I'll have will be easy to pirate if Valve ever goes down. So it's like, whatever on that part. But
It is very funny that you and everyone else, even people who defend this, and I'm not saying you're defending their policies or anything, but every time somebody brings that up, they're like, well, I'll just pirate it. That's always the answer, is piracy. And it's weird that these companies are kind of setting themselves up for that. Like, where you're making the pirates the victors.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, for sure, but like, with PC games, I mean, it's always been the case. Like, there's always been PC piracy. It's not like,
yeah, of course,
a system where you have to figure out how to hack it.
Yeah,
and in theory, it could not be hacked. But
yeah, piracy has always been a thing. I mean, no one's disputing that. It's more that, at least back in the day, you know, like if you had a Sega Genesis or something, piracy wasn't really necessary to preserve those games. Like, obviously it helps in the fact that you can rip them and digitally archive them, as ironic as that may sound, but it wasn't mandatory for the fan base to archive content, whereas it is in the era we've entered, largely because of internet dependency and the fact that the creators of said content don't support it in perpetuity, and it's absurd to think that they would. Like, in their quote-unquote defense, can you realistically expect them to constantly spend money to upkeep servers for, like, 20-year-old content? Like, that's where we're getting. Like, you realize we're only 2 years away, now at this point, little over a year, actually, from the 20th anniversary of the Xbox 360. And we're supposed to just expect Microsoft to support that indefinitely?
No.
You know,
but
it's yeah, go ahead.
I don't think anyone realistically expected them to. Like, it's one, like, the thing with what was happening with, like, the discovery content with PlayStation that's so egregious is that
yeah,
Sony's server, like, Sony's servers for selling movies and downloading movies are still up. It's just that Warner Brothers, their Discovery and Warner Brothers, like, license that they gave Sony has a clause in them that's like, yeah, when this is up, people can't even re-download it, is the big issue. Like, anyone reasonably would expect that hey, the system that the store is set to support doesn't exist anymore, and the servers for the store go down completely. You can't re-download your games.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, yeah. And it's, I guess, the point I've been trying to make across all these videos is like, look, you're probably not going to change that. So the best you can do is try to fight for additional consumer rights to protect in those situations. And I saw this guy bring this up in the comments section, and I thought it was a pretty interesting point, which is if you look at the car industry, at least in the United States, when a company like Chevy, Ford, whatever it is, they make a new car, they have to guarantee at least 10 years of support to it. Now, after that 10 years, it's not like your car disappears or they repo it. That would be the digital age. But unless you're the Tesla where they can shut it down with a firmware update, but that's a different discussion. But the car will still work. You then have the right to self-repair. But they're guaranteeing it for at least 10 years, even if they abandon the concept. Like myself, I own a Chevy Volt, right? Now, the Volt is a cool car, but they gave up on that concept. So it's every time I've ever had to take it in for maintenance, which admittedly was only like once, they basically said, like, yeah, we always have to bring in, like, a special guy to handle that because we don't really deal with Volts anymore, but they're, like, legally required to. So, yeah, it's just kind of interesting that we could maybe use a law like that with digital infrastructure. It's just that you'd have to extend it beyond 10 years. You know, I don't know what the number is. Is 20 years enough? And how do you guarantee... Now, I know this sounds ridiculous, but how do you guarantee that Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, Valve themselves will exist in 20 years from that point? And then,
I mean, you can't, is the problem.
Exactly the point I'm making. Like, if I had told you in 1994, you know, the year that Sega released the Genesis 2, they released the 32X, the Saturn. They released a million things that year. It was the craziest year in the history of Sega. If I could have told you in 1994 that only in like 6 short years Sega wouldn't be doing video game consoles anymore, you probably would have thought I was insane. And yet that's what happened. So it's not impossible for companies to go belly up for any number of reasons or to quit their support. Now, I don't think Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo are in any trouble. I'm not saying that. But I think we had discussed at some point that Microsoft was considering, if not by 2029, if they're not seeing different returns, they might just bail on the Xbox brand. And if that's the case, I mean, the fallout of something like that would be unbelievable.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, and same with Sony, for any reason. And Nintendo is probably the most egregious when it comes to long-term support of their online infrastructure. I mean, they already took the Wii U offline. You know, I mean, the
3DS predated the Wii U, so yeah. But yeah, like the Wii U eShop, it's gone. You can't I don't think you can re-download anything.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I'm stressing. And, you know, I when it comes to Steam and Valve, like, I cannot say this enough. In fact, I have it. Somebody had actually took the time to dig through the EULA of the Steam user agreement. I know you kind of talked about it there for a second, about how I can't tell you how many videos I've done over the years, particularly like 10 years ago when I did the Xbox One like DRM debacle video. I don't know if anybody out there remembers that video. But when I was basically I was preaching about like how this is really bad for consumer rights. You can go through the comment section of that video. I guarantee you'll see a ton of Steam users and PC users, but Steam specifically, who are just going on a tirade, laughing about it and saying, "Oh, you don't have to worry though, because Steam is guaranteed." And that's where that whole thing comes about, like where they say, if Steam ever goes out of business, then they'll just unlock all the content for free. And I'm like, that is the dumbest thing to think that could ever happen. To think that
I don't even know where they actually said that. I've only heard people said that they did
I've never seen the original source. I've just seen there's this belief in that community that that's absolutely a thing. But to anyone out there who's still listening, because apparently every time I talk about Steam, people get very offended. But this is the truth. This is an exact excerpt from the EULA from Steam when you subscribe to any part of their service and download any single game. And for the record, they refer to when they say content and services, they're referring content means games, services means their software. This is the exact clause. The content and services are licensed, not sold. Your license confers no title or ownership in the content and services. To make use of the content and services, you must have a Steam account and may be required to be running to the Steam client and maintaining a connection to the internet. They are telling you, straight up to your face, we told you bought a game, you didn't actually buy it. You rented it, and we're going to let you hold on to it as long as we feel like that's okay. That cannot be stressed enough. And that the fact that you have to use Steam's launcher, which is their own property, which they could change for any reason. I'm not saying Steam's a bad guy. I'm simply saying understand that you are trusting them in perpetuity to do the right thing. And this applies to Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, any of them. This one is just the interesting example because this discussion has been thrown in my face 1,000 times about how Steam always does the right thing. And to those people, I would like to say, Gaben Newell does the right thing. He likes that, and he's running a privately managed company that he is solely in charge of. If he retires, he dies, the company goes public, whatever it is, that can change with whoever takes over. Which I also mentioned in a video. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep, I did.
The response to that was also equally hilarious. Because a lot of people are like, well, he's got his son in place, and his son's going to do the same thing. I'm like, yeah.
How do you know that?
How do you know that? Like, how do you know? Like, there's so many examples. History is littered with examples of benevolent kings or rulers who had their son take over, who destroyed the empire. It's not the same. You're just trusting that situation to work out, and that's, I think, incredibly stupid, to be quite frank.
Yeah, like that's why I said, I went into this, like, with Steam, like, knowing that at some point I'd probably have to pirate everything I still cared about.
Sure.
By the time Valve actually goes. But with PC games, usually, like, it's a little bit less so now with Denuvo and stuff like that. But, like, it used to be that the games were cracked and available to pirate. Sometimes it still is, like, before the game launches. So it was never going to realistically be a problem of, oh no, my Steam account went down and I can't play any of the games I have. I guess I'll have to buy them again or whatever, when I could just go and be like, I bought this already, I'll go pirate it. Assuming, I remember I already own the game. Which, with Steam sales, isn't actually a real case where we're like, I own that? But, oh.
Yeah, again, I have no problem with people wanting to play games digitally. I understand the convenience. What I have a problem with is the fact that they're always believing that they're purchasing something that they're not. And I just don't know how many more examples you need. I talked to you briefly about this. I was tagged on Twitter today. So someone had, this tweet is over a year old, but someone had tweeted at Amazon about a digital purchase that they were not able to get back to. Like, I think they bought some video content on Amazon Prime or whatever. And the response was, hello, your purchase titles may become unavailable due to licensing restrictions or for other limited reasons. You can read more about this here. Amazon, and this isn't the only example, this is just their, someone on their Twitter account, basically has made the case not only here, but in court, that no reasonable person should believe digital content is property. So they're basically saying, if you send us money for this digital content that we told you bought, it is actively totally okay for us to take it away from you for any number of reasons. And that would mean you didn't buy it because you don't actually own it. You don't have the right to sell it. You don't have the right to return it. You can't exchange it. It can be taken away from you without your consent, which is not how property law works. Because if you possess something as property, if someone were to take it from you, that is theft. No one argues that this is theft, at least not from a legal perspective. And if that's the case, it's not property. And if it's not property, you start to get into a gray legal area where it cannot be stolen because it's not property. And if it can't be stolen, ipso facto, piracy becomes legal. Now, I'm not advocating for that either, which people are also saying, oh, you're just saying we should all be pirates. I'm like, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is...
Yeah, that's dumb coming from a game collecting channel. Like,
I know,
you're like the last you're like the last person who would be usually advocating for piracy. You're going out of your way to buy games that the company's making no money off of anymore.
Right. I own Spider-Man Web of Fire for the 32X, for fuck's sake. I get it. Yeah. Nobody ever needs to own that game. But yeah, so like, I guess I can't, obviously I can't solve this, but I'm just saying we're in a situation where it's a legal gray area, and I really want that language cleaned up because I don't want people getting screwed over this. I personally do not think under any circumstances that digital content is property. But I know not everybody goes to that extreme. So the best you can do is at least protect the rights of the customers so that they know what they're actually getting into. But at the same time, I can look at it from that corporate side and go like, if Amazon's like, look, we don't own Warner Brothers movies. We just don't. So if Warner Brothers tells us we're not allowed to distribute their content anymore, all right, then we're not allowed to. So what are we supposed to do? Refund everybody who bought something 4 years ago? Well, theoretically, yes. And that's where a law has to come into place to make that all kind of cleared up. So the only thing I can think of is that if you create a law that basically said at least within the United States, digital distribution had to be guaranteed up to 10 years on any sort of service. And if for any reason that failed, you're required to submit refunds, or if the federal government was really willing to take that head on, they would have to basically create server farms that were actually controlled and run by the federal government somewhere, which opens a whole different option of problems. God. Exactly. Yeah. So all I'm saying is I don't have the solution. But what I do think is you need one, or we're just going to keep ending up in this situation over and over again.
At the very least, I know you've mentioned that Amazon's argued in court that no reasonable person would expect digital content to be property. I looked into it. I wasn't able to find a actual settled lawsuit, or not settled. Find an actual lawsuit where it was actually affirmed that was the case. So at the very least, at some point, a lawsuit needs to happen, if only to get the courts to actually legally rule in on this, regardless of how it is.
Yes. Well, so far there have been a handful of cases, and every time the corporations have won that out. I think it was Apple won a case that was very similar to that, where somebody sued them over so they had somebody, I don't know who, had $10,000 worth of music they had purchased, quote unquote, in iTunes, and they did something that violated their terms of service, so Apple shut down their account. And they were like, whoa, they're trying to fight that back. They're like, I want access to my account. And they're like, no, you can't have it. So they're like, all right, well then either give me the money back or just give me the music offline because I bought it. And they're like, no, it's not yours, you didn't really own it. So they had some sort of suit over this, and if I recall correctly, Apple won. Because they're like, yeah, it's in the terms of service that you don't really own any of this. And all I'm saying is, without some sort of legal action, and the case I'm referring to was a few years ago from what I recall. But if there is not some sort of change within the United States law in particular, but of course this applies to any part of the world that cares about this, you will just get this happening over and over and over. And the longer that goes, the harder that is going to be to correct. Because if it becomes socially accepted that a digital purchase is not a purchase, then they have no incentive to ever change it. And that's it. You're just okay with the fact that content you claim to have bought can be revoked from you at any time for any reason. I personally think that's gross. That's all. But yeah, do you have any other thoughts on this, or have we just kind of already said everything necessary?
We've basically said everything necessary. For the most part, my perspective is basically just the whole, I went into this, but knowing I'd have to pirate eventually, for the most part. But you even before this section here you've kind of already gone over this several times recently. Yeah. So.
It's an important subject to understand because it's definitely a call to action. If you are an American, this is the kind of thing you should contact your congressman or even your senator about, because this is something significant that you're going to be doing not only for yourself but for future generations. Because it's short of a Carrington event, the internet's probably not going anywhere. So, preservation of history and preservation of digital and physical rights for property is kind of important. Especially because, I mean, I haven't met anybody this stupid yet, but you got to think we're going to get to a point where there are people buying that content thinking there's some sort of investment in it. You know,
oh
like,
my God. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we're going to get to a point, because, I mean, we have people who invested in Beanie Babies thinking that was like a real thing, like, or that it was going to be.
My mom was an avid Beanie Baby collector.
I understand exactly my point. But at least at the end of it, they had a bunch of fluffy toys, I guess. But you can't tell me that the generation that grew up entirely on digital content, that looks at their account and sees like a metric ton of games and thinks, wow, this is big, this is valuable. You can't tell me there isn't a part of them that's going to grow up to think that that actually has real tangible value. I mean, we are talking about the same potential community like that. I mean, you know, because you're in retro gaming just like I am. This is like almost like the WADA Club, you know, where it's just, hey, graded games are worth like $1 million. It's like, no, they're not. But my point is that people have a tendency to think some stupid things are valuable. And it would not take much for me to believe that someone thinks because they spent $10,000 on an iTunes account that that's an investment. When in actuality, it couldn't more not be an investment. But
I mean, in theory, you could maybe argue that like a PS3 with a bunch of digital content on it might, in theory, be valuable if it wasn't, you know, for the whole CMOS battery bomb thing. But in actuality, no. But
not even that case, because you're talking about the games. The only ones that have value are the delisted ones, right?
Well, no, I mean, I would be saying like down the line when like all of the PS3 servers are completely down and you'd be keeping whatever old account was on it. But,
oh, sure.
But like even then, like with the CMOS bomb, it's like, well, it's dead. We replaced the battery. Oh, now we can't turn on the PS3. So that doesn't work either.
That's just one of them. But yeah, exactly. My point is just, I don't think people have thought all the way through when they were trading away their rights for convenience, what eventually that was going to lead to. Like, I'm no big fan of Game Pass, but at least Game Pass didn't lie to you about what it is.
Oh, yeah,
you don't
for
download
sure.
it. You know, Disney Plus didn't lie to you about what you're getting, to an extent, anyway. As far as, like, it's not your property. They got that. It's the big one is when you go to download something, you buy it, quote unquote, and then you find out later, by the way, not really. I don't know why that would be tolerated. It wouldn't be tolerated in anything else. You know, nope. I imagine, Joseph, you're sitting there with a computer desk somewhere around you.
Yep, literally at it.
Right, exactly, as am I. That's why I cited it. So, when did you get that desk?
About 2017, I think.
Okay, so 2017, you sat down, you bought that computer desk, you brought it home, put it together, whatever. And I don't know who made it. Let's, for argument's sake, let's say it was IKEA. What if IKEA came to you in like 3 years from now and said, yeah, that model is no longer supported. We have to take that out of your house. And you would think the situation was absolutely ridiculous.
Well, yeah, especially in my case, we're like, yeah, I bought this off a friend of mine. Who
yeah, exactly.
What are you talking about? I bought it from you. It's not supported. You're taking it away. Precisely.
But for some reason, that mentality is tolerated in digital media, and if I'm honest, I think it's part of the reason it's tolerated is, as of now, as weird as it might sound, the internet is relatively young as a concept. I myself am older than the internet, effectively, at least as we think of it now. And digital distribution as a concept is also a much younger concept, meaning the majority of it that has been created is still serviced and still supported. But every time one falls through the cracks, that's when you notice this problem. It's not going to... We're getting to a point, like I said, the Xbox 360 is nearly 20 years old. We're going to get to a point sooner than later where we start seeing massive unplugs of what we think of as like legacy digital infrastructure, where we're just kind of shocked that that's all happening. Especially in the retro gaming community, because we all, probably remember the launch of the 360 pretty well. But that's just one example, and this isn't exactly going to get better unless you start writing laws to protect for people now. And I don't
even then, realistically, like in the case of the 360, like what realistically can we do? Like it's 20 years old already. The servers that host most of the content that would be coming to it are old. The connections that it uses are old and insecure, which is why at the end of the year, Steam's not going to support Windows 7 anymore.
Yep.
Because it's the operating system's unsupported and it's a security risks. But that means that anyone with Windows 7 won't be able to play their games anymore, which is not a thing I knew about at the time when I first started getting into being a PC gamer. But
yeah. And I mean that's the problem is like we're moving forward and more legacy content is not going to be supported for one reason or another, which is entirely the problem because when people started buying quote unquote this stuff, they didn't know that. And so even if Microsoft were like, hey, it's been 20 years, we're going to be shutting down the Xbox 360. We're giving everyone like 6 months to go ahead and re-download anything off of it that they already quote unquote own. That's like, a small thing, I guess, that would be helpful. But at the same time, it's I don't know, man. That's still.
I mean, everyone's going to freak out and be like, "What the hell?" Because we know that's what they're going to do because that's what we did when Sony did it. Was going to do it to the point where Sony actually pulled it back because they're like, "Oh wow, holy crap! Okay, no, we're going to wait a couple more years."
Yeah, it was a PR nightmare when Jim Ryan tried to shut down PS3, Vita, and PSP stores. I don't know. Nintendo gets away with it just because they don't really care what people think. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like all I'm really saying here is that it's really hard to know what that reaction is going to be because it's almost unprecedented outside of smaller incidents, and it's I don't know what the solution is because even if Microsoft's like, all right, yeah, we're gonna do this, you have 6 months, they're trying to be as good guy about it as possible. You have to say that there's some part of you that goes, well, if you're taking it away from me, then I'm entitled to a refund. But you're not because it's not property. So in order to clean all that up, you have to define what property is in the digital age and what rights you as a consumer have. And I will maintain that as long as you cannot sell it, return it, or disconnect it, then you don't own it. I also maintain it has to be physical, but that's a separate me. At least from a legal perspective, if I can't sell it, it's not property.
Right.
Like if I can't sell it, even if it's worthless, like, yeah, I mean, theoretically, like I own the property that's currently in my garbage can. No one wants that, but I can theoretically say it is my right to be a lunatic. I can legally be a lunatic who goes outside and be like, who wants to buy my garbage? I can do that. If I wanted to, I have absolutely no way to sell any sort of downloaded game that I may or may not possess. With the sole exception of that being maybe DRM-free GOG releases. And that would effectively...
And even then, that's piracy. Not really so much... Yeah, that's
I'm just selling... Piracy.
That's not legal.
Yeah, exactly. So there is really no method there. So, I feel like a lawyer needs to really write up a nice cleanup definition and somehow get Congress to act on that. But good luck with that. Anyway, we've spent a lot of time on this, even because we're both passionate about it. But should we move forward, you think? Yeah,
probably a good idea.
Okay, so thank you, Joseph, for sort of picking that subject. I appreciate that. So the next one up is we got a new Patreon backer. His name is Sinjit Randhawa. Forgive me on the pronunciation, dude. So he's at the level in which he gets to pick a subject. And the question he had was, what if Sega didn't make the Sega CD or the 32X and just stuck to the Mega Drive? Would the Saturn have been more successful? And I told him I probably would have broken this down into a more of a historical analysis of why that couldn't have happened. But I'm going to let you kind of do the fan answer first if you're interested.
Sure. As far as I believe, anyway, if Sega hadn't made the Sega CD or the 32X, and they just stuck to the Mega Drive, would the Saturn have been more successful? I'm gonna say yes. Would it have been more successful enough to matter here in the US? Is a completely different question. Part of the reason why the Saturn didn't do too well here was A, the surprise launch and it being $100 more than the PlayStation, plus, the 32X had just come out and it was immediately basically like, yep, here's the 32X, nope, never mind. That definitely didn't help. But at the same time, from everything I've read basically said that the Saturn was a complete nightmare to program for. And that doesn't go away just because Sega never realized that the 32X was a stupid idea and never released it. That part of the Saturn is still true. Sony still undercuts Sega by $100 at the E3 that Sega announces that the Saturn is out. Sega still pisses off all the retailers by surprise launching it months early, where there's like maybe 2 games available for the thing when there were supposed to be like 6 or however many there were. It would have been more successful because people wouldn't have been burned off the 32X, but I don't think that alone would have been enough to change much of anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I'm going to go ahead and give the, let's say, the destruction of the question version. So history-wise, so usually that's a common question, like, oh, don't you think the Saturn could have worked if maybe the Sega CD and 32X didn't happen? Just because people like to think that, oh, those are really what hurt them, and that's why the Saturn did bad. That would be a very incomplete piece of the story. In order to understand that question, you kind of have to ask, why did they make the Sega CD or the 32X in the first place?
And honestly, let's just be real here. This, for an add-on to an existing console, the Sega CD didn't do too bad when it came out.
It actually is the most successful add-on ever created.
Yeah. We just think of it as a failure now because we know where Sega's everything led to.
Yes, exactly. So the Sega CD, we have to remember, was born because the Mega Drive was a flop in Japan. We think of the Genesis as a huge success in North America because it was. Mega Drive was a success in Europe because it was. But it was actually like a complete dead fish in Japan. Like it lost out to the Super Famicom, the Famicom, the PC Engine. It was not a well-performing system. But it was also a Japanese system, so it was very kind of embarrassing for them because it was like Sega as a company was making all their money off of Gaijin. It wasn't making money at home. Mm-hmm. And at home, they couldn't do anything about it. So they kept trying to... They recognized that they couldn't just give up on it because it was making too much money overseas. So they had to support it. But how do you try to reinvigorate the brand and that particular hardware in Japan? So they had a whole bunch of weird ideas, which is why the Genesis was so integrated into a whole bunch of other stuff. Because they were trying to appeal to technology. Like the Mega Jet, which I did a video on and everything, is a portable version of the Sega Mega Drive for Japan, only for airlines. Actually, have I done that video yet? I don't even remember.
Yes, you have.
I did. I don't even remember. I know I've talked about it before, but anyway. So, like, they just kept trying to find different ways to appeal to the Japanese. The Sega CD was kind of born of that. There is this kind of belief that the Sega CD came about because of the Super Nintendo, and they wanted to compete with it more directly. There may be some truth to that, but at the same time, I believe, if I recall correctly, the Sega CD and the Super Famicom basically came out in the same year. There wasn't a whole lot of time to R&D for that reason. I think that the Super Famicom came out in 1990, the tail end of 1990, and I think the Sega CD either came out in 1990 or 1991, just barely after it.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. So
no, the Sega CD was meant to, I think, compete with the PC Engine CD, if anything.
More accurately, yes, but people don't pay attention to that because the TurboGrafx CD was a complete dead animal in North America. Mm-hmm. It was created as a technological boom. You got to remember, CD technology was very new. Most people didn't even have CD players yet. So the property value of it, per se, was that if you bought this attachment for the Genesis you already had, at least in North America, you would now have a CD player with it, which was pretty special. But in Japan, it was more about CDs and karaoke especially being super popular. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to have that at home? Well, how do you do that? Well, look, Sega made this console, and they have this other thing that goes with it. Maybe that'll move some units. That's what that was about. It wasn't really about the competition with the Super Nintendo. And then the 32X was born of completely ironic and totally opposite reasons. The Japanese never wanted the 32X in the first place. Sega of Japan did, but only for the purposes of giving to North America. Because in North America, the Genesis was so crazy popular. Sega of Japan, they knew they had to move on from the Mega Drive in Japan for reasons already stated. But they just were afraid of what would happen to the Genesis if they cut it off, because that was where all their revenue was coming from. So there was this very brief and short-sighted thought that what if the next generation of hardware for North America was just an attachment? You know, the 32X is literally an attachment to the Genesis. It upgrades you to the next generation, which in a sense, had they stuck to it, would have been one of the most pro-consumer moves ever, because rather than force you to buy a $300 console, you could buy this $150 attachment for the thing you've already got. You get all the backwards compatibility with it, and now you have the next generation system. On paper, not a bad idea. But as I understand it, North America, the Sega of America didn't really like the idea either, because they just thought, well, yeah, that seemed like a bad, short-sighted thought, but Sega of Japan called the shots. And
yeah, like it was. I think it was originally going to be its own like separate thing. That was basically just an upgraded
Neptune.
Genesis. Yeah, the Neptune. It was going to be the Neptune, and then there were
sort of
some people were like,
"Go ahead."
Like, I mean, granted, this is from me. I'm getting this from like reading that Console Wars book, so who knows how fully accurate it is. But basically, like when it was discussed, like the whole Neptune thing, and people were like, in Sega of America, supposedly, according to that book, which is according to people involved who the author talked to,
Tom Kalinske.
Mostly Tom Kalinske. It was basically like, wait, so if this is just going to be a souped-up Genesis with better colors and like some more processing power, why don't we just make it like an add-on? So even then, if that's true originally, and it still would have basically had been a separate system if it had gone the way it was originally planned. So it's like, I don't know. Assuming if that's accurate.
It was a half-baked idea. It was partially born of the Virtua Racer game. Virtua Racer on the Genesis is a unique game. It has this thing called, I think it's called the SP1 chip, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And it uses an extra piece of hardware that squeezes more power out of the Genesis because the cartridge itself is doing more of the processing. But they realized it was impossible to keep selling games that way because it was too expensive. And the 32X was kind of like, okay, we'll sell you the hardware once, and then after that, 32X specific games will be able to utilize it. It was a combination of ideas that probably made sense for like a few weeks, and unfortunately they acted on it. But further evidence of how detached both regions of Sega really were on this. Are you aware that effectively, not literally, but effectively, the 32X and the Sega Saturn both came out on the same day?
I did remember hearing that, yeah.
Here's the thing. The Sega Saturn launched in Japan on November 22nd, 1994. The 32X launched in North America. So in this case, we're talking about the initial release dates of both pieces of hardware. The 32X launched on November 21st, 1994, which would be the day before, except when you account for time zones and Japan always being a day ahead, they came out on the same day. So wrap your mind around that, everybody. That's how disorganized Sega was. They had two competing pieces of 5th gen hardware that they both made. They came out on the same day, half a world apart. They were a strange company.
They were.
So to get to the point of, would that have made the Saturn more successful? We also have to understand why the Saturn is what it is. Because if you understand that Sega basically designed the Sega CD for the Japanese market to detach itself from the Mega Drive, and then force the 32X to try and latch on to the Genesis, what you have to understand about the Saturn is the Sega of Japan designed it to retake Japan. That was their priority. That's why the Saturn has no backwards compatibility with the Genesis or Mega Drive. They clearly had considered it at one point. That's why the memory card slot on the back is so big. There are actually prototypes of it where they had the shape of a Mega Drive cartridge. But Sega of Japan thought, this is actually a negative. We don't want to remind people of the system we had that was a flop. We want to have a completely detached thing that is just, this is the future of Sega, and we're going to focus on that, and that's what the Saturn's going to be. And ironically...
And to think, yeah, that exact situation got flipped when it came time for the Dreamcast.
Precisely. But ironically, for the Japanese mindset of what they were thinking about the Saturn, they were actually correct. Because even though we in the West tend to ignore this, or we're unaware of it, the Saturn was actually really successful in Japan. It actually beat the N64, which is, most people don't ever know that. So the Japanese were very good at creating a system for their own market. They just weren't very good at presenting it to other markets. The problem Sega always had in its hardware is they could never come up with a uniform strategy for every region. Like, you can look at the PlayStation brand today. One of the huge advantages Sony has always had is that every time they put out a system, it is pretty much uniformly agreed upon in every section of the world. If they put it out in Japan, they put it out in North America, they put it out in Europe, and they approach it with the same strategy, and it's always been successful. Or if the system fails in any one of those regions, it fails in all of them for the same reason. Whether it's the PS3 initially, the Vita, whatever it is, it always happens uniformly. Sega ran into the problem where their hardware was successful in one country, unsuccessful in another, then maybe kind of successful in another. That led to all this insane divisive hardware that they had. The only time in their history where they actually had a uniform strategy was the Dreamcast.
And that was
just too little too late. Exactly. And, you know, because you look at the Dreamcast, and us in North America, I remember being a kid. Now, maybe this was just more of the fantasy whims of a child, wondering why it didn't have, like, Genesis backwards compatibility built in. Why didn't they put that in there? Because, of course, I didn't even know about the Saturn for the longest time. And then you have people wondering, you know, in Japan, why the Dreamcast didn't support Saturn stuff. And in both cases, they were like, it would have just made the system too expensive to build that in. And the whole goal was to make the system affordable and get it into homes as quickly as possible before whatever Sony came out with. Because if I remember correctly, the Dreamcast only retailed for like $200 initially. Like,
yeah, that sounds about right.
That was a pretty reasonable price point, even in
I actually asked for a Dreamcast at some point. I didn't get it because by the time I asked about it, like, the PS2 was around the corner, and my dad went out and got that instead. He was like, because everyone basically told him that it was like, yeah, no, he's not going to be happy with the Dreamcast, get him this. And I was still happy with the PS2, but, like, I did actually ask for a Dreamcast after having the PS1 and not having a Saturn. So...
Yeah, no, exactly. So when you get a question like this, the only thing you can do to really understand it is understand how we got to that point. The original sin of all of this is the fact that the Mega Drive was not successful in Japan. If it had been successful in Japan, history would have been very different. Because they probably would never have made the Sega CD in the first place, because it would have been superfluous. Because the only reason they made it is because the Japanese market wasn't doing well. The 32X, they would never have even considered it because it was unnecessary. They would have been more on the let's all be on the same page thing. I will almost guarantee whatever the Saturn would have been, which it wouldn't have been the same system we ultimately got. But I can almost guarantee had the Mega Drive been successful in Japan, Saturn definitely would have had backwards compatibility built in, which certainly would have helped the North American audience and the European audience as well. That's really what it is. And I didn't used to understand that, because I even to this day, I don't really understand what it was that the Japanese rejected about the Mega Drive. And I always thought maybe Sega just did a shoddy job with it. But I look back and I'm like, dude, they did everything they could to appeal to the Japanese. Like, everything they could, including just attaching it to so many other insane stuff, which is why there's so many weird versions of the Mega Drive that we never got. One's integrated with music CD devices like the Iowa Boombox. There's obviously the Pioneer Laser Active. We did get that because Laserdiscs were popular. Obviously, we just talked about Sega CD for all of its own reasons. You know, the Mega Jet, as we said. It's just fascinating to me that they just couldn't catch a break with it. Like, no matter
this would have been such a good Rob question, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But he's not here because he sucks. But he's all right. But yeah, no, I appreciate the discussion. So, but the fantasy answer is, like, I guess.
I mean, even by a fantasy answer, not really. Like, because it would have been more successful, but it wouldn't have been enough to help.
Yeah, I essentially agree. So I'm not really sure what else you could have done about it.
Now, like to get back onto one thing you brought up with the whole Mega Drive in Japan thing, the only thing I could vaguely think of why it would fail would ironically be part of the reason why the Saturn failed here. Sega's past history with various hardwares. Because remember, like the Sega made the SG-1000, that came out like the same day as the Famicom, and then they went to the Mark III Master System, and then they went to the Mega Drive. Like,
so you're
Sega always
talking about the Curse of 3.
Yeah, Sega basically not even that, but Sega just rapidly, Sega basically always rapidly innovated with their stuff and moved on. It's this system doesn't work. Okay, make a slightly better one, rename it, send it out again. Oh, that one didn't work. Okay, kill that one, make a new one. Even with the Saturn and the Dreamcast, it's okay, well, 2/3 of our market didn't like the Saturn. Okay, let's make the Dreamcast. Sega has a pretty solid track record of just bailing immediately and going on to whatever the next thing was.
There is definitely truth to that. So if that's the case, then you would argue the original sin is the SG-1000 release.
Yeah, on it, that, and honestly, the question we should be asking ourselves isn't necessarily why the Mega Drive failed. It should be in Japan. It should be how the hell did the Saturn succeed? Is probably the better.
I would actually argue that's the Curse of 3 thing is actually legit. If you guys don't familiar with this, in console company history, usually the third system every single one of them ever does fails. And there's a reason for that, which is usually most companies that try to make a video game system, they get one shot, which is why Casio, well, okay, to be fair, technically Casio had two, but Apple only made one home console ever. There's a bunch of companies Amstrad made one, Commodore made one. Most of them don't get a second chance because if it fails, they don't come back. 3DO, one, effectively. So if you made a second one, there was a good chance your first one was successful. And so the second time around, you try to find all the things you did right about it, and then you try to get rid of the things you did wrong, and you improve. And sometimes that works, and you have something that's a juggernaut success like the PlayStation 2, or you create something that falls on its face and kicks you out completely, like, NEC going from the PC Engine to the PCFX, which completely killed their chance of being in the video game industry. But typically, if you get to a third one, you're very established. And by the time you're very established, you start to believe your own BS and you tend to make bad decisions. So I'll look at the most obvious examples of this. So in the United States and Western culture, if we look at Sega, we all forget SG-1000 because we really didn't get it. So the Master System is the one that, if people even know about that one, they tend to be like, oh, that was a thing. Well, it did well enough, obviously, because the Europeans mostly carried it. So it got it. They did fine. They got it. Then we think about the Genesis. That was their big hit that made them super successful. So they were able to stick around. Depending if you include the Sega CDR32X or not. Then you get to the Saturn. And that's the one everybody's like, oh, man, that was the one that was a huge failure. Well, that was a screw up. And then, if you get a fourth one, you kind of come back. Sony, for all their systems, I think it's pretty agreed the PS3 was the only one that ever really had a chance of legitimate failure. When it initially launched, everybody hated it. It was too expensive. I liked it,
but yeah, it was I also got it worked at retail at the time and was able to use my employee discount on it plus another discount. So I got it for several $100 off. So
yeah. Exactly, but that thing's initial launch was a complete disaster. It was, and I don't need to go down memory lane there. Nintendo kind of did this twice. The N64 was their Curse of 3, which was it made money, but it did not end up being the huge success that the NES and the Super Nintendo had been. Developers hated it because they didn't want to be dealing with cartridges anymore. and Nintendo's really strict, policies on third-party support, they basically created their enemy in giving PlayStation like a legitimate foothold because of their own mistakes. And the same thing would kind of happen with the Wii when the 3 consoles later, even though that thing again made tons of money, it really alienated developers and just kind of killed a lot of their actual fan base as opposed to the temporary fan base, which eventually hurt them when they got to the Wii U.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and that's just, the Wii U would be the one that was cursed in that case, but it basically bore the sins of its predecessor. So, it happens. It's usually a curse of 3. Microsoft, I mean, I don't think anybody forgets the initial reaction to the Xbox One.
No.
It's kind of impossible not to. So, it always happens. Or it's just how it is with the video game history. So, for the Japanese, the SG-1000 is where it started. I think you're totally right about that. And amusingly, the SG-1000 it's part of its problem. I can't be sure of this, but part of its problem might be that the SG-1000 is the only Sega console developed by Sega when they were still an American company. Did you know that?
I do remember hearing you say that. Yeah.
Yeah. The first model was when Sega used to be an American company. They'd started in Hawaii and they were sold. They were owned by Gulf and Western, which is basically Paramount Pictures now, or Viacom more accurately, the whole corporation. And they were sold off to a Japanese company, and then they just more or less became Sega. I forget all the exact details. But the SG-1000 was only released in Japan, but was largely engineered by Americans. And after they were completely detached from it, they tried it again by having the Japanese completely rebuild it to the Model 2, which was actually far more successful, which is effectively the Sega Mark II. But that stuff got super confusing over there, I imagine, because Sega Mark III is the Master System. And yeah, you're absolutely right that it was too much too quickly, and it was probably them just trying to clean house. So the original sin to the Japanese failure of the Mega Drive probably was the somewhat rushed release of the SG-1000. So if you ever really wanted to redo,
or I guess more accurately, the second one after that,
the Mark III or the Mark II.
The Mark II. Oh, I guess it depends on what the Mark II is, but that or
Mark
the Mark
II is just a redesigned version. It was an entirely Japanese redesigned version of the SG-1000.
Okay, so that would have been like the Mark III then, depending on how quickly.
The Mark III is effectively just the Master System.
Yes, but
right,
that one would have been the one that would have harmed the Mega Drive.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the only way to truly have redone this would have been to, I don't know, somehow move Sega to Japan a year earlier than they did, and then have them just develop an entirely in-house console that was just better than the Famicom. That was really the only way you were going to do it.
Release it on the same day of the Famicom with an inferior product was not ever going to be. Granted, I mean, to be fair, neither Sega or Nintendo at the time had experience making real home consoles.
Correct.
At that point. So it's not like they had anything to go off of.
Precisely. Hindsight 2020 would be if you had released the Sega Master System in Japan in 1983.
Right.
Or the Mark III. If they had been able to do that somehow and then had a competent game library to go with it, that's when that could have worked. But yeah, that's you have to basically go all the way back to their console origins to narrow that down. Yeah. Anyway, I think we've answered this question as best we can. So,
probably.
To Sinjit, thank you very much for the subject. Also going to give shout outs here to Spencer Per Year for his subject, Abdullah for joining me earlier, as well as Cax, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, and obviously you, Joseph. Thank you very much for joining me, and to everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to everybody listening, thank you so much as always for listening. I hope you have a happy New Year, happy holidays, all that fun stuff. If you could, please like, comment, subscribe, check all the social media stuff in the description, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, as well, especially the Patreon, because that's how you can get this and all the other stuff, early access. I appreciate the support. Thank you so much, and I look forward to bringing you guys more content in the new year.